What if I told you that in the US, a good outcome in childbirth can still leave a lasting wound, and that the difference often isn't in the care or the medicine, it's the experience? In this episode of The Architecture of Healing, we're talking with Adrienne Erdman, Director of Design Research at Ewing and Vice President of Research and Development for the Trauma-Informed Design Society, about what healthcare leaders are missing when we measure successes only by clinical outcomes. Adrienne shares research from a National Birth Experience survey and a striking finding. Roughly 40% of respondents described their birth as traumatic. Through the lens of personal experience, we unpack why operations, handoffs, noise, lighting, partner accommodations, and even documentation can compound into harm, and what designing with people, not for them, looks like in real life. If you're a leader, clinician, planner, or practitioner, this conversation will change how you think about safety, dignity, and trust in maternity care. Welcome, Adrienne. It's great to have you on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, as we get started, I would love for you to share a little bit about you, your background, and your role.
Yeah, sure. So I have two roles. So my day job is the Director of Design Research for Ewing, and we work across all of our practices, but I would say I specialize in healthcare and science and technology. And really what we do is we bring research, systems thinking, human-centered design into real design decisions so that we can have our designs deliver more impact. My other role is a volunteer position as the Vice President of Research and Development for the Trauma-Informed Design Society. And our aim is to advance education, best practices, and evidence on trauma-informed approaches specific to the built environment. Although in the future, we hope to expand that into other avenues such as product design, service design.
So your background includes architecture, but also human factors. And how do those come together and lead you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I definitely got to where I am through a different path than most. So I have a degree in biomedical engineering. I thought I wanted to be a doctor and kind of quickly learned that I would have a better impact, or I related better to what I was doing when I was working on actual products that were to be used, because it felt like the life of that extended beyond just the interaction. So I worked on medical device and product development for about 10 years as a human factors engineer. During that time, I also went to school at Boston Architectural College because I've always loved space design and had a couple of instances of my own environment negatively impacting me. And so it just like really sparked this interest to learn more. And I got a degree in design for human health. It's a master's of design studies. But I also loved my job. So I stayed there, had this piece of paper for 8 years that I did nothing with. And then the time came when we were going to move offices, my last company, and I got to apply the same human-centered design aspects and human factors thinking to that project. And it just lit a fire under me. And I knew it was time to give it a try. So that was about 3 years ago when I made that transition into the architecture industry and haven't looked back.
So how does human factors, and if you could describe a little bit about what that is, how does that relate to architecture, design, and space?
Yeah, so human factors is the study of everything that makes us human beings. So it's trying to design for our capabilities and limitations that have evolved over tens of thousands of years. And so it's looking at things like biomechanics, physiology, cognitive science, psychology, sociology, the list goes on, and figuring out how does that fit into what we're designing. So it can be from a functional standpoint, like what does this design physically allow me to do, but it can also be from an emotional and experiential standpoint. So it's really trying to pull all of it. And I always describe it as like I'm the liaison for the user and really for the human, because we also want to think of them as more than just a user. They're a human being with needs and things that comprise how they the world, and we need to be respectful of that when we're designing. So for product design, it was definitely very focused on artifacts that you hold. And then for space, it's just expanding the scope of that. And it's also looking at a little bit more of like macro level behavior, a little bit more of systems thinking. So looking at all of the different elements operations and how that then fits into what you're designing.
Is there maybe an personal experience or a project that has really shaped your perspective in the work that you do?
Yes. So I guess there's two things coming to mind. One is a project I worked on for an auto injector where we had to design for 9 different medical conditions. Most of them were immunocompromised conditions where people had disabilities. And I want to say like 20 different drugs could fit into the auto injector. It was absurd, like 100 languages. They wanted to also win a design award. So it was this first time where I've really experienced the push and pull of everything that makes a good design. So I always advocated for usability, but there's also aesthetics because that helps to define like the emotional attachment you might have with something. There was also this whole commercial side of how can we make this so that our client could market it to their clients in order to want to use it? How can then we market it to doctors to recommend it to their patients? And then it was also, from an engineering standpoint, extremely difficult to fit all of the mechanics within it. So just like really, I think, opened my mind beyond my own worldview to say there are all these competing factors and you've got to find the right balance of everything while still trying to do the best you can within your own discipline. So that's one that I think really started to get me thinking holistically about the work that I do. The other project that has really changed me, I would say, professionally, is I was working on a surgical robotic system as a project manager and a human factors person. So I quickly learned that you don't want on a big project like that. But one of the biggest things was I was worried that I would bother people or burden them if I had them start to articulate a project plan with me. So I would always just pull it together and say, hey, team, here's the plan. Here's what we're doing. And it did not go well. People were really upset, feeling like I had pushed something on them rather than involving them in developing the project plan. And so I lost the trust and the rapport of my team. And I had this aha moment that the same co-design principles that I advocate for in design itself also needs to be applied to any sort of project planning, any sort of team development, because it ultimately comes down to buy-in, trust, rapport. And there was no way that we were going to perform well as a team if I wasn't demonstrating that trust. So I think it really highlighted for me the significance of designing with people for.
For sure. How do you take those needs of individuals, balance that with the clinical needs of a product or a space from the staff or the people using it versus what's really happening in real time? How might you go about weighing all those competing priorities?
So one thing I've noticed is that patient journeys have become really popular in architectural design research. That actually has a foundation in UX design and service design. And I think they're great because it reinforces the idea of designing for the patient or for the customer. And it emphasizes a non-clinical point of view, which I also really appreciate. But where I think it falls short is it's not necessarily connecting it to all of the other elements of the system. So things like the staff journey, not just for them to do their work, but also to be well as human beings. And then also to keep the building and the clinical machine running, so the operations aspect. So what I like to do is borrow, again, from service design and use something called a service blueprint. And essentially what it is, it's grounded in the patient journey as its like bone, but then you define at a more detailed level all of the interactions that are happening with the journey, the patient journey. So there's this thing called the line of visibility to define your front stage interactions, the things that people can see, and then the backstage interactions. So what are all of the things that you have to do to make that journey a reality as opposed to just an aspiration? So I think that exercise is really helpful in making sure that people are backing up what they say they want to deliver on rather than it just being this kind of pie in the sky thing that you say you're doing, but you can't necessarily how you're doing it.
I know that a lot of your work lately has centered around the birth experience, both professionally and as an extension personally. Can you talk about the She Said exhibit, then also some of your research and how that is leading to new findings
and how your personal experiences have impacted your professional work and research.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with what the project is. So we ran a survey about a year ago now with individuals in the United States who have given birth. And we ended up with just shy of 400 responses. We wanted to ask a lot of different questions to help characterize birth experience for those individuals. So everything from where did you give birth, what did you encounter along the way, to like how did you feel about it, to what is your ideal birth experience. And the whole point of that was to identify factors that influence what someone experiences, both positively and negatively. And that was inspired actually by my colleague Susie Gensler, who did the same type of survey work about 12 years prior as part of her master's thesis. And I honestly don't remember like how it came up in conversation, but at some point we saw it and we're like, this is so cool. We should do this again to see what's happening. And we ran the survey again, and it's just blossomed from there. It's been really interesting to see all of the different connections we've been making. Like, we've made a connection to an artist, we've made connections to architect who's also a midwife and a doula. And then it's also evolved into this She Said exhibit that you mentioned. So, what this was, it was an art installation using audio and video at a colloquium that was hosted in Toronto this past October. And the colloquium was really to bring a number of researchers and people who are passionate about birth design together and just take stock of what do we know, what do we not know, what are we aiming for, how do we want to make a difference in this space. And as part of the colloquium, they had an exhibit to feature projects or case studies or art installations like us. And so what ours was, it featured video, pictures, and then sound bites. And the sound bites were quotes pulled from our survey respondents. And we've overlaid them on different videos and pictures to create this like emotional storytelling. So the whole purpose was really to like center around the voice of the person giving birth, as opposed to focusing on the environment itself. And so we partnered with a filmmaker to work on that. And it was just, I think it was a really cool experience and is probably one of the research outputs I'm most proud of because of how different it is and how much it really embodied this idea, experience, listening, and voice more than you could ever get just from reading a report.
So, what are some of the highlights from your findings?
One of the things that really stuck out, first and foremost, was that about 40% of people considered their birth to be traumatic. And that was a really sobering thing, I think, to read. And what's also sobering was a lot of these women had a good outcome. So, what it really started to force us to think about is that experience does not equal outcome. And there's always this talk around, maternal outcomes and infant outcomes in this country are declining. And that's a very important issue for us to be concerned about. But I think even more so, the fact that for the women who are having good outcomes, they're still leaving with these lasting memories that are. And being involved with the Trauma Informed Design Society, I am very aware of the long-term health impacts of trauma. And I myself am a survivor of trauma. So I've also had that lived experience coming into view and just understanding how difficult it can be to work through that. And so it really is highlighting this need for additional support for mothers, or even just a conversation around the fact that this is happening so that we can try to design for the experience too, and not just the outcome.
So, how has your own experience informed that? We've talked about this previously, so I hope I'm not putting you too much on the spot here, but would you be willing to share a little bit about how your own personal experiences has shaped your perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I have two children, and so I've given birth to two times. And it's really interesting when I was reflecting on the two of them, how they were opposites in some ways. So my first birth The prenatal period was more or less fine, but where problems started to come up was in the labor and delivery aspect of my hospital stay. My second birth was actually the reverse. So, with my first child, this was during COVID. It was 2021. COVID restrictions were still in place. So, it started out with my husband was not able to accompany me with any of my prenatal appointments. So he missed the first heartbeat, the first ultrasound, all those moments that you dream about when you're starting a family. And that ultrasound happened probably 2 days also before I moved from Boston to Atlanta. And I remember calling a lot of different OBs to find my new care provider in Atlanta. And everyone's, oh, we're not accepting new patients or we're not accepting transfer patients, including the practice I ended up with. They did not accept transfer patients. So what ended up happening was they thought I was going to confirm a new pregnancy. And I showed up at like 17 or 18 weeks and they're like, oh, you're pregnant. So at that point, they had no choice to just let me in the door and accept me as a patient. But I mentioned that because we talked a little bit about access. And so that brings up just some interesting points around the fragility of access to care, even reflecting on these two like very metropolitan, very healthcare oriented centers in the country. So you can only imagine like how much more difficult and fragile it could be for those in rural areas. So anyway, fast forward to right when I was preparing to give birth, I was going through a lot of emotional things. I have some family history that is very complicated and was making my preparation for birth very challenging. And at the same time, I was looking at having a very large baby. And so there were conversations around having an induction and being prepared for a C-section. And I really didn't want that. So I'm not like anti-medicine or anti-intervention, but it was more so like I wanted to feel this experience and work with my body and work with my baby in order to bring him into the world. And I was really, they tell you like, as soon as you write a plan down, it's out of date. So I know that logically, right? But emotionally, that's what I wanted. And I ended up like having possibly my water broke. So they had me come in just to check me. At that point, it was like I thought I might be having an induction the next day, but they hadn't confirmed it with me at all. I show up at the hospital and they're like, oh, yeah, you're supposed to be here tomorrow morning anyway. I'm like, okay, cool. So it's confirmed. And I just decided to keep me and start my induction early. And this is really where everything just started to fall apart. So I had this perfect storm coming together of my emotional traumatic situation I was trying to deal with from my family side. And then everything you could imagine operationally went wrong. So I had the COVID restrictions. Then with the induction, it wasn't progressing. So they started to do the Cervidil, which is like the next step, beefing up the induction. And in short, what happened is they lost the Cervidil. And it resulted in some physical trauma to my body that meant that we couldn't try the induction anymore. So in combination with that and my son being so large, we had conversations around the C-section. And that I was just so, I think the best way to describe it is I was grieving what I wanted. I was like so emotional about it. And my provider was wonderful in talking me through it and helping. She had patience with me and letting me express how I felt, and helping me to work towards being okay with it. So I'm very grateful for that. But what then happened was they had me start fasting. We're about to go in for surgery and they realized my labs had expired. So we had to redo my labs, which meant I'm now like fasting longer than I should have been after already at this point I'd been there for 24 hours. And then they had me like gowned down trying to do the epidural, and my nurse anesthetist and my room nurse got into a fight in my room. So verbal altercations to the point that the nurse anesthetist just left. And they came over the loudspeaker and they're like, we need someone, just anyone, just to this room, please. which when you're nervous and you're in a situation you don't want to be in anyway, like that doesn't give you any sort of peace, right?
Wow.
Anyway, they did that and things are progressing, but I think it's just everything snowballed at that point. I ended up having a panic attack on the OR table. And then afterwards, I remember this day trying to breastfeed and my milk had not come in. And my son, I kid you not, was latched for 17 hours out of a day. So that's 17 hours that I was not sleeping and I completely had a mental breakdown. And my clinical staff knew I wanted to breastfeed, but they took it as like breastfeed at all costs, which was not me. I'm a first-time mother. I don't even know what formula is, which is crazy to say now, but everything is so new. You don't think about advocating or asking for things. And the person who told me that was an option was the person emptying my trash. She recognized that I was struggling and said, "Hey, have you thought about asking for formula?" And my husband and I were like, "You can do that?" So I want to highlight all of those details to just demonstrate sometimes these things that seem inconsequential in isolation, when you understand the impact on the other side and how it might compound with other things, it's actually a very big deal in making sure that we have the operations well suited for what's happening and whatnot. So my second birth, I mentioned it was opposite, right? So there were a couple of like peculiarities with my first one, but really everything was fine. The second birth or pregnancy, the first appointment, I made a point to ask them if there was going to be an ultrasound because my husband had missed out and we were thinking maybe naively like this was going to be a redemption. And the person on the phone scheduling me was like rude and dismissive. And was like, "No, it's just to take a test, confirm it." Well, I show up and there's an ultrasound. My husband's not there. And I found out that I had a vanishing twin. So not only did my husband miss out on this really important moment, I think for anyone who has a family and has been through this, they understand how deep that moment is. But then to also find out that like I had lost a baby while I'm by myself was just like unacceptable. And it's like I asked the right questions. I advocated for myself. I'm supposed to know better now as this like veteran mom. And yet the system is still failing me. So fast forward a few weeks, I was traveling internationally and I had unexpected bleeding. And I had to go to the emergency department abroad, which is a story for another time. And coming out of that, the physician, everything was like fine. But the physician gave me a write-up and said, "You need to call your doctor as soon as you get home to be seen, just to make sure to establish this moment in your record with your provider." So the second I landed, it was like 30 minutes before closing on a Friday. So I was like eager to get someone on the phone and asked to schedule. And the scheduler was like, "Well, I can't just put you on the schedule." And I'm like, "A doctor told me to do this." And she's, "Yeah, but it's not our doctor." And it was like one of those moments where I was like, I don't understand the issue here. And I guess she like booked me under, I don't know, like prenatal testing or something. She found a way to loophole me in, but it was just like one of those things that seems so backwards to me that like I had to argue for an appointment to deal with an emergent situation. Like you would think that would be the other way around. So my provider was like pretty appalled like when she heard about this, and they've actually since used all of these circumstances as training. But you don't want to be the guinea pig, right? And the last thing that happened is about 3 weeks before I was due, I was planning the entire time to VBAC. So I've explained how I felt about really wanting to do a vaginal birth, and I didn't want to go through a C-section again. And I remember my doctor made a point to tell us that I had what's called a double wall closure from my first C-section. And I really trusted her. Like she made a point to listen to me and how I felt. But 3 weeks before birth, my doctor just figured, "Oh, I'm going to check the surgical notes." And it said a single wall closure. She said, "No doctor will attempt a VBAC with you if you have this." So now I'm like stuck at this, what I believe a documentation error dictating the future of my entire childbirthing journey. So again, this like theme of the little things that seem inconsequential actually can have lasting impacts. So if that had been provided to me early, I could have had that time to grieve. I could have had time to mentally prepare myself and work out what my plan is moving forward. Instead, I had 3 weeks to scramble at that point to get comfortable with what I was going into. And then once I was there, it went fine. I definitely was in a better headspace. And but at that time, I became more aware of my space. So there's still, I think, a long ways to go to bringing the environment of birth up to par, like with just respecting the fact that this is a family event where people are meant to create memories. It's not about the outcome, it's about this pivotal moment in creating a literal family. And so I think if you think of anywhere in the hospital, it needs to have family-centered care. This is the spot, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that really stuck out to me was being in the OR. Because I was in a better headspace, I was very aware of everything around me. Like, you hear the sounds of surgery. There's bright lights in your face. It's definitely an opportunity, I think, to almost reduce the sensory experience a little bit from others. And then once my son came out, he was put in a giraffe behind me. And I'm like trying to twist my body and my head as best I can to see him, and I can't. So it's everyone else in the room can see him, but not me. And I think there's opportunity to make mothers in this situation feel like an active participant in birth as opposed to just something happening to them. And so I think that would be like a really cool design challenge for folks to figure out, how do you do that? How do you make that feel more like you have a part in it, or at least just more involved in the interactions within the room?
That is a huge experience. Wow. I am so sorry that you had to navigate that with the challenges and operational issues during the delivery, and the second with the prenatal challenges and coordination and communication and all of those things. And I myself have not quite this similar, but somewhat similar circumstances I would love to get into at some point, but that's just so difficult when you're in such a vulnerable place, but also in such an exciting period as well, and balancing that. It almost feels as if those experiences lacked a level of empathy for the patient and treating the patient with dignity and respect. And not to say that it wasn't just a person on a really bad day. And maybe that was the case in some places. And to imagine 40% of women have similar or somewhat traumatic experiences is shocking.
And I say I had a traumatic experience, and without hearing the full story, you're like, oh, okay, no, a bad thing happened to you. But I had like thing after thing go wrong. And it's just, I think this is where you asked about how my background of human factors plays in. It's the work that I've done has always been very qualitative in nature, just based on kind of what was required for that type of work. And I think that was actually great training for me, because if you were to see some numbers on paper, sometimes it seems okay, where you say, oh, that's acceptable. Like if you were to say, oh, 1 in 100,000 patients, a death happened. Sounds good on paper, right? Very small percentage. But for that one patient and their family, and even the staff that experienced it, like the level of trauma and challenge and just everything that goes on around adverse situation, like you start to appreciate why we need to listen more to, I think, some of the stories that are happening and overly focus on the numbers.
Yeah. So, taking your experience and some of these stories that you've been a part of or have the opportunity to hear, how does that start to inform your thought process when you work with, say, the design teams at your organization, thinking through new ideas or supportive environments that facilitate operational improvements so that some of these issues may not happen continually?
First and foremost, like we want to start with some level of listening, because I think to your point about feeling like there was a lack of empathy for the patient, I think we need to build. And because we know that experience is in part shaped by operations and space and everything else, it's going to be a little different no matter which place you go. So hearing stories from one place or pulling things from literature, I think that's great because it gives you a foundation to work from. But you need to also understand some of the nuance of specific context so that you know what it is you need to give more attention to within the design process. And then I think it's also exploring some of these, I guess I want to say contradictions. It's like there's a push and pull of some things or tensions between things that you need to include within your design. And I think having some open conversations around those is really important for some of these types of situations where, technically speaking, most mothers are not sick coming into a hospital. They're healthy and they're here to do something that's a very normal physiological process. But there is that medical side of liability and doing no harm and doing right by the patient for safety. So exploring what does it mean to have safety and comfort balanced with each other, having standardization balanced with personalization, having medical readiness balanced with emotional support. Maybe it's not designing for the worst case situation, which is what a lot of birth spaces have now. Instead, designing for everything to go well, physiologically, normally, but being prepared to escalate to a higher acuity level of care if need be. So putting equipment on space or site, having some space within the room to move around, having all different types of tools to facilitate birth, like a birthing ball or a rope that you can bear your weight down on. There's a lot of different things I think you can do to support the natural process before having to escalate it to higher level of care.
Yeah. And you touched on this with the OR and the lights and the sterile
Mm-hmm.
environment and the noises, but are there other areas in the physical environment that you have identified shortcomings or areas that just aren't working for either the staff or the patient?
Yeah, so definitely this environmental stress that you just described. So the idea of noise, cold temperatures, poor lighting, or constant interruptions. I think every person who's been in a maternity ward can laugh at they come in as soon as you fall asleep or as soon as the baby
It's
falls
it's
asleep.
it's not the baby keeping you awake, it's all of the interruptions.
And they always come in, Mama, it's time for bubble. And you're like, ah. And also the reality of staff turnover. Yes, I understand the need for staff to go home and rest. Like that's important. But I think when you're staying there for multiple days, it does start to have this idea of you're meeting your new staff over and over. So I think it's recognizing some of those things you can't control, such as the handoffs and staff turnover. But then there are things that you can control, such as reducing some of the sensory overload, or at least giving people the opportunity to control it, because it's going to be a little different for every person and depending on what state of mind they're in at any given time. There's also some things that are just like low hanging fruit. Like I remember with my first birth, they wanted us to keep the light on overnight so we could see the baby. But the light was like right over where my husband was trying to sleep. So, and you couldn't dim it, right? So it's just like one of those low things where this shouldn't be happening. So
Yeah.
I think it's just smart placement of some of those things can go a long way. Beyond that, I think a couple of the other things that are starting to surface up from our survey is the poor partner and family accommodations. So I gave an example just then, but even from our survey, we saw that only 25% reported having access to a couch or a convertible bed for their partner. A lot of them had chairs. I remember reading a few responses that like there wasn't anywhere for the partner to even be in the operating room. And I think these are small things, in my mind that can be included in the design to make the partner feel part of the process. And then I think beyond having them in there, again, just trying to connect the dots to what does the experience look like is really important. So I'll give an example. So in my second birth experience, postpartum, I was in a hospital bed, of course, and the room was this like weird kind of L shape. We were at the end of the hall. You could tell we were like the extra room they tried to squeeze into the floor because every other room was a rectangle. And my bed was in kind of the fatter part of the L, and then the couch was in this alcove off to the side. So what that meant was that my husband was behind me because the hospital bed is a little ways in front of the wall and then it's inclined. So you're up a little bit even further. So I have an incision, right? And I can't move
Yeah.
my abdomen. So I'm like, I can't really turn to talk to him. And so it's weird to not be able to like look at your husband face to have a conversation, or he's gonna hate that I said this. There was like one day he was like dead asleep and the baby was crying and I needed something, but I couldn't walk yet. So I'm like throwing snacks at him because I can't turn to wake him up.
Yes.
It's just those little things. And even like the alcove was positioned where he couldn't see the TV. So it's poor guy is like sitting there trying to entertain himself because he can't interact with the rest of the room. Yeah, I think it's just don't just be like, check, we have a chair, but think about, okay, what is this actually gonna look like in real life? Like, it doesn't take much to just act out what the positioning might look like, or you could do a full scale mock up to figure that out, but just do something to try to connect those dots and make sure that you're delivering on the promise of it, not just saying that you are.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to have you back on to interview me because for those of you who don't know, I've got two kiddos and I've got another one on the way here actually in about 6 weeks. So I will be having these experiences firsthand. And as a birthing partner, our first two were very different, had somewhat of a traumatic experience as well. And fingers crossed, number three goes smoothly. But I can totally relate. With the whole snack thing, I told my wife, I'm going to bring you a Nerf gun so that you can just shoot me from across the room with the Nerf gun. And then you can get my attention because I am a hard sleeper and I'm just dead to the world. That would be really fun just to go through this experience from the other side of things. One topic I do want to touch on is related to your choices when it comes to how you're giving birth in those experiences and getting maybe zooming up to a higher perspective or vantage point. Birthing centers are becoming ever more popular and a choice among moms for their labor and birthing experience. And we are seeing a huge decrease in, especially in rural communities, women's and maternity services. I saw an article here in Becker's even just this week. 124 rural hospitals have closed their maternity services over the last 6 years across the country. And top happens to be the state that I'm in, Indiana, which has closed 13 since 2020. And that just further makes access to care for these services so much more difficult. Some organizations use OB services as an opportunity to capture patients for life, so to speak, as they get their children in and their children receive care. They receive care from the same organization. But then also with this new kind of, or with the trend here recently, I think there's a big shift happening in this space. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and perspective on how people choose where they go and what their journey wants to look like.
It's really interesting because when it comes to access, I think what's happening in the more rural areas is really hard for me to swallow. I touched on it earlier, this concept of the fragility of access, right? And I experienced it even being in a privileged situation of being in Boston. It's one of the most well-known medical areas in the world. And Atlanta has a number of really great hospital systems. And I still struggled to get care. And when we asked a question in the survey around what drove your decision for where you gave birth, one of the most predominant answers was it's where my provider gives birth. And I think a lot of times our decisions are limited, not even by what physically is in our area, which definitely has a part, but it's what can I pay for? What can my insurance pay for? And in some cases, we had folks who were military and they had one option. So I think it's really interesting to see how the insurance system that is so complicated in our country plays into that piece of it. And then I think the other is sometimes not even being aware of what's available to you. So in my area, I know of all the hospital systems. I think there's a greater kind of prevalence of them. They're bigger, so you see them. They're usually on the side of a highway. There's advertisements on TV. So you're more aware of that is the choice. And I think a lot of times there's this narrative around you rush to the hospital. You watch things in the movie and there's this idea of hurrying and you're going to a hospital. I wasn't really aware of medical centers or birth centers in my area. And my provider definitely didn't work in those areas. And I think the other piece of it is there's a lot of factors that can dictate whether you or your baby are high risk. And that may either for the patient themselves, they may want that peace of mind of being in a hospital. In other cases, it's mandated. You don't actually have a choice. Like you wouldn't be able to go into a birth center. So I think there's probably some advancement we could do around maybe beefing up what's birth centers or at least advocating for potential skill sets and services are available there to give women that peace of mind, to show them they have more options than what they think. The last thing I'll mention, which I thought was really interesting, the same mothers who said their experience was traumatic also said they would go back to their hospital. And I'm one of them. So I can speak a little bit from like the person's point of view, but I think it comes down to familiarity. It's you would rather deal with the devil you know than go with uncertainty and unknown. And so I think that's also, I think healthcare systems should think very hard about the power, I guess, they're given in that way. Like having one experience with the patient might lock them in because now they know you, right? They'd rather go with something familiar and know what they're getting themselves into. So I think it means that healthcare systems should take that position seriously and think about how do I elevate that experience? How do I make it ethical or positive or any number of adjectives so that you're providing a good experience from the very first go round?
To that point, with birthing centers and adding more services, I think we are starting to see the capabilities of some birthing centers increase, as are we seeing different types of options offered in acute care hospitals. For example, I am working on a labor and delivery and NICU floor right now with a local hospital, and they are adding birthing tubs to the inpatient floor and just adding this additional layer of experience. They're having midwifery programs, doulas, they're providing a range of options for moms and patients. It's really exciting to see these. And again, who knows what the future holds, but there is change afoot in this space for sure.
Yeah, you can feel it. Last year, I believe Florida passed some legislation around allowing C-sections in standalone birth centers, which is huge. There's probably differing opinions maybe on that situation, but I think thinking about myself and what I may have wanted looking back, like that's really huge. And I think part of it is there's that emphasis on the family unit, that it's a memory that you're creating, not just a clinical situation. And there's more of that emphasis on home-like stuff and giving more of the power and control back to the patient and the partner in that situation. And so I think it's really cool. And you can see a lot more people talking about the need to study women's health and all different elements of care. And there's a lot of technology coming out that's specific to women. There's a lot of research being done to better understand how different conditions impact women, because historically, a lot of the data we have is based on white men. And we're discovering that it doesn't impact people the same way. So I think we are at the foot of something for change, and I'm really excited to see where things are headed.
I think it's important to note that this patient population or birthing moms are really the only patient population coming to a hospital completely healthy for something super exciting that they are maybe perhaps experiencing for the first time in their lives, second, third, or for some of the crazier folks, fifth, sixth, or seventh. But yeah, they are wholly and entirely different than the other patient populations coming to this facility. And I worked with an organization many years ago in a rural community that co-located their OB floor and their OB department next to their oncology department. And it was very poetic because you have people coming in on the most exciting days of their lives with their first, second, or third child right next to the unit where you have people maybe experiencing some of the last days of their lives. And they are having this really spiritual encounter almost, seeing these children being born, hearing the cries, and remembering why life is so important and the experiences that they've had over the course of their lives. So it was just such a cool way to set up a space. And everybody thought it was crazy to do it that way. But I think it has turned out in such a meaningful way for those patients and the staff that work on those units too. Super, super cool.
I love that. I think it really plays into that idea that this is a life milestone. It's a life event, a family event. People bring all of their baggage of their everyday lives and their history into the space, whether that's good or bad. These experiences are about family, and whether you are conscious of it or not, you're bringing all of that into your experience, and it's part of what shapes it. So I think that's such a beautiful way that space honored that idea of the circular way of life.
That's,
Such a
yeah,
cool thing.
absolutely. Coming to a close here, big thinking question, and maybe zooming out way high above birthing spaces. But if you could redesign or change one thing in healthcare, what would it be?
So it might not surprise you, but it's the prenatal experience, but not completely for the reasons that I've illustrated in my story. I think some of the most just annoying things, I'm sure you'll relate to this, is like it's a 5-minute appointment, but it takes 3 hours of your day. Yeah, every time you have to drop off a urine sample, and like women who are pregnant are like professional peers at that point, and yet I had to go down this crazy long hallway. There's one bathroom. We're all waiting in line, taking our turns. Like, I just think there's some things that like we could deal with the logistics a little bit better of what is required for that care. And then also recognizing the fact that these are working people most of the time who are taking large chunks of time out of their day every other week, basically, for 9 months to come in and see the doctor. So give them a place to work, give them like books to read, give them somewhere to eat. I think just again, recognizing how the experience plays out in
Yeah.
life and seeing what you can do to support people a little bit better so that they can actually show up to their appointments on time. They can stick with the care regimens that they're
Yeah.
supposed to.
What works in theory or on paper may not actually work in real life. Listen back a few episodes. Before long, you'll have a smart toilet that'll do your urinalysis at home and you won't even need to go wait in line. So we'll get there.
Yeah.
All right. I know you've been waiting for this part very eagerly. The lightning round. Very excited to hear from you on these. First question: what is one of your favorite healing spaces?
A little embarrassed, but it's my bed. It's where my nervous system settles. I love sleep. I love to lay in bed. It's where I snuggle with my boys. Yeah, that's my happy place.
Awesome. What inspires you outside of work?
I think just observing everything around me. I love people watching. I love just like connecting the dots between things that seem unrelated. Like I've referenced airport design, working on clinical registration and lobbies. And I think having two young kids who ask me why all the time has helped me be a little bit more inquisitive and just be like, well, why is it that way? And it's been a cool experience, I think, to be curious at that level again. So yeah, I'd say just observing things around me very earnestly is what inspires me.
We all need to embrace our inner 3-year-old and ask why a little more often.
Yeah.
What is a book that has changed the way you think?
The Coaching Habit. So it's a very simple idea behind being a leader, which is, I'm paraphrasing, but it's shut up and listen. So I think, again, it just reflects back to that experience I mentioned where planning a project for someone didn't work. I had to plan with them. And so just asking what people think, what's on their minds, and letting them lead you towards it rather than jumping in an answer right away. I still have to practice that, but I think that was just a really pivotal mind shift for me that I'm seeing it return on dividends for years.
So good. So good. I couldn't agree with that more. And lastly, finish this sentence. The future of healthcare is blank.
Holistic. So I think it has to be well-rounded and consider everything that's going on within each person's lives or its work. One of your previous guests talked about this idea of thinking about nutrition and what's in your surroundings. And I couldn't agree more. That's, you interact with those things just mountains more than you do with any interaction, at least the average person. So that's where I feel like a lot of our health is going to make that difference. So let's acknowledge that when a patient comes into care, and then when we're developing a care plan for them, make sure that what we're developing fits into that lifestyle so that they can actually keep up with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so much more than just healthcare. Well, Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast today. This has been truly an inspiring conversation. I want to thank you also for your vulnerability and sharing your own personal experiences. And I hope that we can all glean a thing or two from that in the work that we are doing. For others listening in, we would love to hear from you about your own experiences, how you're seeing birthing spaces evolve with the work that you're doing. So thank you again, Adrienne. This has been fantastic. And again, hopefully we'll get a part 2 where you can interview me on my own birthing experiences.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
This conversation highlights an important reality. Clinical outcomes tell only part of the story. Adrienne's research and personal experiences invite us to look more closely at how operations, environment, communications, and empathy shape the way care is remembered long after discharge. From service blueprinting to sensory considerations and family accommodations, this episode offered thoughtful perspectives on how design and systems thinking can better support birthing families and care teams alike. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with a colleague who's thinking about the future of maternity care or patient experience. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Architecture of Healing and leave a review. It helps more healthcare leaders and designers join the dialogue. We'll see you next time as we continue exploring how thoughtful design and smart strategies shape the future of healthcare.